Hello and welcome, my name is Retro, and today we will be covering Gauss. But I'd like to get a few things out of the way before we get too far into the video. First of all, the thumbnail for this video will likely say something along the lines of best Gauss setup. I want to make it perfectly clear, I'm not insinuating that my specific mod setup or my companion and weapon picks for this setup is the best weapon mod setup for Gauss. I'm suggesting that this build idea, the core concept behind the build, is the best version to run a DPS build for Gauss. Weapon platform builds, because Gauss is also a very good weapon platform, are a whole different can of worms, so I'm not going to say this is better than weapon platform builds, but I do believe this is the best build idea for a nuke setup when it comes to Gauss, and I'll explain why I think that later on in the video. But I would highly encourage you to go and use your own mods on the build to make it more in line towards your playstyles. And I would also sure that someone else out there can probably take the core idea that I've got on this build and optimize it further than what I have in this video and make it even better than what I'm showcasing. So again, I'm not saying that my setup specifically is the best. I'm saying that this basic idea is the best nuke setup that you can have on Gauss. Also, furthermore, normally in these videos, I like to cover the Warframe's abilities and details, unless I have previously made a video of that Warframe. I have actually made a video for Gauss in the past, however, it was my second video I ever made on this channel, and the quality of video, quite frankly, is quite bad. So I'm not going to accept anyone to watching that video just so they can understand how Gauss's kit works if they don't already know. However, at the same time, Gauss's kit has a lot going on. He is the Warframe, as far as I'm aware, that has the most things that he can do in a single package. That's to say that he does more things than any other Warframe in the entire game. From grouping, to damage buffs, to nuking, to armor stripping, the list just goes on and on and on and on. And quite frankly, I could spend 20 minutes just explaining his abilities. And for the purpose of not making this video as long as possible, I am actually going to not talk about his abilities within this video. But what I am going to do is I'm going to make a second video that will be posted onto my channel as unlisted, which will go over Gauss's build abilities in detail, and that will be the entire video just talking about Gauss's abilities in detail. So if you do want to learn more about Gauss's videos, do check out that video. The link to that video will be in the description down below. It will be an unlisted video, so the only way to access that video will actually be in the description of this video. So if you want to understand Gauss's abilities more because you don't know how it works, then I would recommend you check out that video. Otherwise, continue on watching this video. So, and the last thing we have to talk about before we get too much into this build is we need to acknowledge credit where credit is due. This video has been heavily inspired by a video that another Warframe YouTuber by the name of Aznvasion did a year ago or so. I actually went and texted him to make sure that he would be okay with me making this video, because quite frankly, this build, the setup that I'll be showing you in this video is incredibly similar to his setup that he shows off in his video, with a few minor differences to make it a more modern, as a few things have come out to update the build and make it even better and more flexible than the version of the build he set up his own. So I would like to say a lot of credit towards him, as he did come up with the general idea around this build. Also, I would just like to say a general shout out to him in general. He is a much bigger content creator than I am, like way bigger, though he honestly doesn't get enough attention as he should compared to some of the other Warframe YouTubers, because he makes amazing videos. Cannot encourage you to check out his content if you haven't already, more than enough. Additionally, he in his original video also shouts out two other content creators of Worm and Dystopia, and I would also like to shout out them for the same reasons that he does in his original video. Dystopia was the person that kind of laid the ground for this basic idea. He was the one that years ago showed off Gauss's thermal Sunder, his cold thermal Sunder specifically, having an expedite suffering effect with the heat status effect. What that means is when you apply cold thermal Sunder, it removes all the heat status effects on enemies caught within the radius of it, and then applies the damage of the heat status effect to enemies in a single go. Just like how Tragedy, Expedite Suffering, Nezha's fourth ability with the Augment, or Harmony work with all the damage over times. The only difference is Cold Thermal Sunder only works exclusively with the heat status effect. Dystopia originally showed off this video by priming level 9,999 Demolist units with heat status effect with a weapon, and then using Cold Thermal Sunder to blow them up for a lot of damage. However, this setup didn't work for generic AoE nuking, as it was very single target focused. The only way to actually do generic AoE nuking with the setup was with Heat Thermal Sunder by itself, which was actually the setup that Worm showcased in his video. He showed off a build where he would prime enemies with Varro and a heat inherent weapon, and then further increase the damage of that heat status effect with the Heat Thermal Sunder to then nuke them with Cold Thermal Sunder, which also opted to have a lot of damage and a much larger radius. However, Aznvasion came up with an idea to make this build, to take this build to an extra level, to make it even more comfortable Instead of relying on needing to spam Heat Thermal Sunder to apply enemies with the heat status effect, he realized that you could use melee influence to apply the heat status effect to enemies in a wide area much more effectively than what we've previously been able to do, and then nuke them with the Cold Thermal Sunder effect. However, at the time of when his video was made, this was somewhat limited, as heat and electric isn't exactly two things you can get onto a weapon straight away. You needed electric for melee influence, and you needed heat for the Cold Thermal Sunder nuking. And if you attempted to mod both heat and electric on the same weapon, you would end up getting radiation instead of either or. This meant he needed weapons like the Plasma Sword, which is a weapon that you can only get when it shows up in the shop in the Nightwave, or the Prisma Armor, that is even more time locked, as it is a weapon that you can only get from Barrow or by purchasing it for other players for quite a hefty amount of platinum. Or something like the Com, which isn't time locked unlike the other two, as it is one of the Nama weapons, but let's be real, who really wants to do Nama bounties? As these three weapons were the only melee weapons in the game that were able to force proc electricity. The Prisma Armor and the Plasma Sword were able to force proc electricity on slam attacks, and the Com was able to force proc electricity on its unique block combo. The Prisma Armor says it force procs electricity on the wiki, but it actually doesn't, and only has a chance to apply it, making it inconsistently. Basically, what this meant is the build was limited to using one of these three weapons, making it somewhat restrictive. However, recent things have changed, making it so this is no longer true. In recent changes, abilities such as Gauss's own third ability that applies a elemental damage buff has been changed to no longer mix with elements. Meaning now Gauss's third ability, instead of having a heat or a cold buff that mixes with multiple elements, you can get a heat, cold, or a blast buff if you use Blast Thermal Sunder. But we're focusing more specifically on Shock Trooper, which is the augment for the Helminth ability Shock, which is Volt's Helminth ability. Shock Trooper allows us to have electricity on our weapons, which will not mix with multi elements, meaning we can mod for heat on the weapon and also have electricity to apply to trigger melee influence. This allows us to use melee influence to prime enemies in a large area without restricting you into one of three melees. In this setup, with recent changes, you are now able to use any melee in the entire game for the setup. Personally, I chose the Gunsent Prime as it is one of the only two Warframe primes in the game, and although I do believe the Crossless Prime would actually be better for the setup, I don't have the Crossless Prime. And Warframe specifically are incredibly good when it comes to status applying, as they have a lot of multi-hits on one of their stances, and multi-hits is essentially Melee's version of multi-shot. However, the beauty of this setup, as I said, is that you can now use this setup with any melee in the game simply by using by getting your electricity from Shock Trooper, making it so you no longer have to be locked into using one of the three weapons I previously mentioned. Now, why is this setup better than other Gauss nuking setups? Well, quite frankly, it is a lot better than simply spamming Heat Sunder to apply enemies with the heat status effect and then popping them with cold, as it is a lot more comfortable and flexible and easier to actually apply the enemies with the heat status effect. It's also better than Heat Thermal Sunder setups. While although Heat Thermal Sunder is very powerful, it is less effective when actually killing enemies and relies more on damage over time and priming, where this setup can easily pop strong enemies very easily. And also Heat Thermal Sunder also drains your battery meter, while Cold Thermal Sunder charges it, making that this ability setup is extremely comfortable in many different ways. It's very comfortable in energy regen thanks to the second ability, it's very comfortable in survivability thanks to Gauss's passive and second ability, and it's very comfortable on your battery because Cold Thermal Sunder will regen it, and you also get battery regen when using a melee weapon as long as your second ability is activated. And lastly, the last thing I want to talk about with the setup is, although this doesn't necessarily change anything from the original Aznvasion build or even the original Worm build, it is an interesting thing to note. When these two builds were originally mentioned and made, they didn't account for the changes to the Blast status effect, as it didn't exist yet. Blast status effect, if you don't know, will apply an AoE explosion to enemies that get inflicted by the Blast status effect, a poor portion of the damage that does. And since Blast Thermal Sunder force procs the Blast status effect, this also means that enemies that get hit by Blast Thermal Sunder will have the Blast status effect triggered on them. While using Heat Thermal Sunder, this doesn't mean much, as Heat Thermal Sunder by itself doesn't do enough damage to really make use of the Blast status effect. effect. However, this setup allows you to have Cold Thermal Sunder do a lot of damage, applying a blast status effect that is a ticking time bomb that actually does quite a bit of damage. This significantly lowers the damage threshold needed to actually nuke with this setup, because even enemies that survive the Cold Thermal Sunder damage itself will likely die from the follow-up blast effect that will then hit them. Additionally, if any enemy that gets caught in the radius of the blast status effect will also receive a good amount of damage from the blast status effect that gets hit in that area. And on top of this, enemies are also just generically weaker now ever since the armor strip that happened to the game, and quite frankly, this build is too strong for base steel path enemies. These are level 180 Xmas units, and I can kill them simply by using my melee weapon and melee influence, without even needing to rely on the actual nuke build in this game, without needing to rely on actual Cold Sunder to actually nuke enemies. And I ended up using Xmas units instead of the normal heavy gunners, because quite frankly, heavy gunners just die too quickly. This build is honestly generally too strong for base steel path enemies, or better yet, base steel path enemies are too weak for this build. And theoretically, this build does have infinitely scaling damage, as you can always just apply more heat status effects before nuking them with Cold Sunder. The only thing that would question about whether or not this build can actually take into endurance is more of a matter of KPM, if you end up slowing down your killing potential because you have more and more time in between actually nuking with Cold Thermal Sunder. But that's yet to be seen, as I haven't actually taken this build to endurance and I don't actually know how it would fare, but in theory, it would still be able to nuke very effectively in endurance runs. If anyone in the comment section wants to go and actually test it and leave a comment about how they go, strongly encouraged. Now let's actually look at the builds itself. Gauss himself is completely free of any Archon shards. I am using Matarai for my focus skill for the casting speed, because his fourth ability does take a decent time to actually activate, which is honestly quite annoying for Gauss, because all of Gauss's other abilities have a very quick casting time, and his fourth ability, funnily enough, gives you casting speed, making Gauss's only ability that actually needs a casting speed buff also an ability that gives casting speed. Because of this, I don't really feel like I want to put Archon shards on Gauss for casting speed, because I get a casting speed buff from his fourth ability, so it doesn't seem right to simply have them just for his fourth ability. But if you wanted a much more flexible playstyle without needing to go in and out of your operator for the casting speed buff from Matarai, or being able to use any other focus skill in the game, then I would recommend using 2 Ember Shards for the casting speed, or even just 1 Tower Force Shard. Additionally, for the build, we are using Corrosive Projection. This is actually very important for the setup, because Gauss's third ability can armor strip enemies, which further increases the damage it does by a good amount. However, only when red line is activated, and the amount it armor strips enemies scales off how far above the red line it is actually up. So this means that if your battery charges at 90%, you aren't stripping enemies by 90%, you are stripping them by 50%, because at 90% battery, you have 10% above the red line of the total 10% you can get, which 20% you can get, which equals to 50% above the red line, meaning 50% armor strip. This means it's actually impossible to get consistent 100% armor strips with this ability. Corrosive Projection lowers the amount of energy. Corrosive Projection lowers the amount of battery we need, making it much more consistent and making it much more comfortable in actually being able to armor strip enemies with Thermal Sunder much more consistently, even when red line's meter isn't at 100%, which shuts off the ability drain of the ability and a battery drain of any of Gauss's other abilities. In the Archon slots, I am using Energize. I actually did test this build without Energize using Energy Nexus, which I'm actually going to get rid of. But I opted to put on Archon Energize anyway. Yes, Gauss's second ability does give you energy regen when you get hit, but quite frankly, this build also has quite a high level of passive crowd control, so I found it a bit inconsistent when it comes to completely relying on energy regen, which is why I also went for Archon Energize. However, there are other ways to get around this. If you don't have Energize, you could use things like Orange Shards for energy or efficiency. I'm also using Arcane Ice Storm, not necessarily for the ability strength, as this build doesn't really need a lot of ability strength, but more for the ability duration. Red line makes it so that using Cold Thermal Sunder on enemies, as long as you are above the actual red line, will automatically freeze enemies, even if they aren't already afflicted with the Cold Sass effect like you would normally need to do with normal Cold Sunder. This means you can essentially get easy 100% uptime on Ice Storm without any needing, because you can easily freeze all enemies within your areas simply just by casting your third ability, which will give you 40% ability duration at max rank. On top of that, we are modding for max range with Overextended Stretch and Augur Reach for max Thermal Sunder nuking. Melee Influence may only have a 20-meter radius, but you will be moving around with Melee Influence, so it's entirely possible that you'll be able to prime enemies with the hit status effect and then move away from them, making them reach outside of that 20-meter radius, which is why I opted to go for more range than anything else for Thermal Sunder to have a 31 range. I also have Prime Continuity, which along with Ice Storm is all the duration we need, as Shock Trooper along with Gauss's fourth and second ability both have quite a long duration, and with Arcane Bless, and these are with Prime Continuity alone, you have 46 seconds on his 4th and 2nd ability, and a full 62 seconds on Shock Trooper. So Arcane Ice Storm will make that even more, giving us a lot of duration on our setup, meaning we don't have to mod for a lot of duration. I am using Primed Rage, as we don't really need a lot of strength, as although Cold Thermal Sunder does scale off strength, 90% of the damage we're getting from Cold Thermal Sunder is scaling off the heat status effects we're applying on an enemy, which doesn't scale off strength, meaning we don't actually need a lot of strength, but I still wanted to have positive strength anyway. Mostly for the buffs that we get from red lines, such as the casting speed buff, attack speed buff, and all stuff like that. Do not run Arcane Fury or Arcane Strike. Arcane Strike is basically just obsolete, as red line actually gives you a attack speed buff. And quite frankly, as I already mentioned, enemies are too weak for this setup, and your melee weapon alone is more than capable of killing enemies. So increasing the damage it does with Arcane Fury is just going to make it so that you're killing enemies with your melee weapon, and you're not going to get the fun damage numbers with Cold Sunder, which kind of ruins the point of the build. Obviously, we have Shock Trooper for the augment for this build, and this is actually a flex slot that you can run whatever you want with. I am running Streamline, but you can put on anything else you want if you want to. Again, this is just my build setup. I do highly encourage you to build whatever setup you like with the whole basic idea of this build, as long as if it fits your playstyle more. As I said, I am using the Gunston Prime, but go ahead and feel free to use any melee weapon you want, as again, for the 3rd time, the beauty of this build is that it can work with any melee weapon without being restricted to 1 of 3 melee weapons. The build I am using is Condition Overload for the extra base damage, along with Berserker Fury for attack speed, Weeping Rings for status chance, Galvanized Elementalist for the status damage as well as the status chance to further increase the damage of the heat status effect that is applied by this weapon, Primed Reach, which will increase the amount of enemies that get hit by the weapon for even more heat priming, and both Molten Impact and Volcanic Edge for a bunch of heat damage. And then we do also have Prime Smite Orokin. Faction mods are incredibly important on this build, as not only do they double dip with damage over time effects like heat, but they actually triple dip with melee influence, meaning not using a faction damage mod is going to cripple your damage and make it so you won't do nearly as much damage with the Cold Thermal Sunder nuking, which again scales off your heat damage. For the companion, honestly, I didn't really find a need for any specific companion, so I opted for Worm for some extra survivability. Gauss' 2nd ability does give you status immunity for cold, heat, blast, stagger, and knockdown, but all the status effects can still hit him, like Toxic. So I opted for Worm to Foot Engage to give me that full status immunity. I also modded on Guardian and Shield Charger on Worm for some additional survivability. Not that Gauss necessarily needs it, but it does make the build even that bit more extra comfortable, as it is already an extremely comfortable build, but this just makes it even more comfortable still. The Messmith mod is so the companion can recover faster if we kill an X-Miss unit when it's down. Manifest Bond is to reduce the cooldown on all 3 of these abilities. Synthetic Construct will increase the amount of health orb drops, which isn't important for this build, but I do reuse my companion builds. Assault mode is needed so the companion can actually attack enemies, and we have Calculated Redirection, Enhanced Fire Hazardity for the companion's survivability, and Vacuum as a must-have mod. The weapon I am using is the Tactico for generic priming to increase the damage of my melee weapon, which further increases the heat damage of it, and which further increases Cold Thermal Sunder's damage. I am simply using Reload Speed, Rifle Aptitude, Prime Tread for status chance, fire rate and punch through, and also multi-shot, and then the rest is just our modded elements. We have radiation, magnetic, viral, plus electricity, which Tactico has inherent. For the utility weapons, I highly encourage running Amalgam Serration on any rifle, along with primary dexterity, and Amalgam Barrel Diffusion plus both Organ mods and secondary dexterity. With both max ranked primary and secondary dexterity, you will have your combo counter at 20 seconds. This allows you to get away with not having to use Neromon's effect for upkeep on your combo duration, allowing you to use Mana Ride for the casting speed for your 4th ability. However, if you do not have max strength, primary, and secondary dexterity, I would highly recommend using Neramon instead. And if your 4th ability really does bug you in terms of casting speed, you can always just use Archon Shards, or you can just put up with it, as it's not too bad, and it is just one ability, and the rest of his abilities cast super quickly. Anyway, that is all for this video. I do hope you enjoyed, and as I said, I will have in the description below a link to an unlisted video that will go over Gauss' abilities in detail if you want to learn more about them. If you did enjoy this video, please check out some of my other content, and maybe you'll find some other stuff you enjoy. And leave a like and a comment and a subscribe to my videos. And if you want, you can also give me recommendations on videos you would like me to see make in the future. You could ask for a specific Warframe guide or build, or you can ask me to talk about some other Warframe content, like a tutorial for some of the systems you might be confused by. Like maybe you want a tutorial on arbitrations, Profit Taker, Eidolons, anything at all. I'm happy to take any recommendations you have for me. And until next time, bye bye!